Hi everyone, welcome back to True Crime Echoes. If you're new here, my name is Your Name, and this is the space where we dive into some of the most haunting true crime stories from the past cases that still leave us with more questions than answers. Tonight's story is one that shook Los Angeles in the late 1950s. It has all the elements of a crime that sounds almost too strange to be real. A knock at the door on Halloween night, a man shot dead in his own home, and a tangled web of love obsession and betrayal hidden beneath the surface of a seemingly ordinary family. This case became known as the trick-or-treat murder, and while it starts with a simple ring of the doorbell, it quickly unravels into a story about desire turned toxic and loyalty pushed to its breaking point. So settle in with me as we go back to that Halloween night in 1957 and uncover the secrets behind the murder of Peter Fabiano. Chapter 1: A Knock on Halloween Night. It was Halloween night 1957. The streets of Los Angeles were alive with laughter children darting from house to house in costumes clutching their bags of candy. Behind every door, families were winding down from the festivities, parents ushering their kids to bed after an evening of trick-or-treating. But at one particular home, something far darker was about to unfold. This is the story of Peter and Betty Fabiano, and it begins with something so ordinary, an unexpected knock at the door. We've all heard it before, the sound of the doorbell echoing through the house late at night, when the world outside feels just a little quieter, a little more dangerous. Most of us would hesitate before answering, but Peter didn't. He was a husband, a father figure, and a man who believed the world was simple and safe enough to open his door. On the other side, instead of children holding candy bags, was something far more sinister. A single gunshot shattered the quiet night, and within moments, Peter lay bleeding inside his own home, his life slipping away before his wife and stepdaughter could even process what had happened. At first glance, it looked like a random act of violence, a senseless crime on a holiday that was supposed to be filled with joy. But as investigators would soon learn, this wasn't about chance or bad timing. This was a crime born out of obsession, jealousy, and a love triangle that spiraled into one of the most shocking murders in Los Angeles history. When I first came across this case, I was struck by how strange it all sounded. The killer arrived in costume, blending into the night like any other trick-or-treater. The motives behind the crime were tangled in secrecy, forbidden relationships, and lies that festered until someone finally pulled the trigger. This is not just the story of a man who answered the wrong knock on his door. It's the story of how passion, rejection, and obsession can twist people into doing the unthinkable. And as we step back into the 1950s together, we're going to untangle how an ordinary couple, their circle of friends, and one determined woman created a chain of events that ended in murder. Chapter 2: Behind Closed Doors. Before we can really understand what happened that night, we need to step back and look at who Peter and Betty Fabiano were, because on the surface they seemed like a perfectly ordinary couple. Peter Fabiano wasn't a man who came from privilege or wealth. He had worked as a truck driver in New York, a steady job that gave him stability but not much excitement. Life was practical, maybe even predictable. But then he met Betty. She was a woman with 2 children from a previous marriage, raising them on her own. And when Peter and Betty crossed paths, something clicked. Their relationship grew quickly, and by the mid-1940s, they were together building a blended family. Eventually, they decided to leave New York behind and move to Los Angeles in 1956. It was a fresh start, a chance to chase opportunity. And instead of staying in trucking, Peter made a surprising pivot. He opened beauty salons. Not just one, but 2. It might seem unusual for a former truck driver to suddenly become the owner of beauty shops, but Peter had ambition. He wanted more out of life, and with Betty by his side, they built a business that gave them both purpose and financial success. Their salons were well known in their neighborhood. Betty helped manage the shops, and Peter handled the business side. Together, they gave the impression of a couple who had it all: a marriage, children, and a growing business. People described Peter as hardworking, charming, and generally well-liked. He wasn't the kind of man anyone thought would end up with enemies. But what I've learned, especially with cases like this, is that appearances can be deceiving. When you look at a family from the outside, you only see the polished surface. Behind closed doors, though, there are always complexities, disagreements, insecurities, secrets. And sometimes those hidden parts of life are what drive the story forward in ways no one could have predicted. For Peter and Betty, the move to Los Angeles looked like the beginning of a bright new chapter. But underneath the success of their beauty salons and the comfort of suburban life, there were cracks forming in their marriage, cracks that someone else, an outsider, would eventually slip into. And that person's presence would set into motion a plan that ended in tragedy. Chapter 3. The Halloween Night Murder. Halloween night 1957 should have been like any other. Kids filled the neighborhood streets in costumes, knocking on doors, trading their trick or treat for candy bars and chocolates. Inside the Fabiano home, the evening was winding down. Betty, her teenage daughter, Judy, and Peter were ready to call it a night. The candy bowl was nearly empty, the porch light had been switched off, and the family slipped into bed exhausted but content. But sometime around 11 p.m., the doorbell rang. That sound, unexpected and sharp against the quiet of the house, startled them. Betty rolled over, half asleep, and nudged Peter. It was late, and she wasn't about to answer the door herself. Peter sighed, probably assuming it was just a straggling group of kids out too late, still searching for one last candy bar. So he got up, grabbed the candy bowl, and walked to the front door. Betty from the bedroom could hear him speaking. His voice carried down the hall as he said something like, "Isn't it a little late for this?" And then almost immediately after, she heard a strange sound. Two voices, low and unnatural. Later, she would say it sounded like men trying to disguise their voices as women. And then it happened. A single deafening pop shattered the stillness of the night. Betty froze. For a split second, she didn't register what she had heard. But when she and Judy rushed to the front door, their worst fear came into focus. Peter was on the floor, just inside the entryway, lying on his back. Blood was spreading quickly, his body unresponsive, his face pale. Betty screamed, trying to shake him awake, while Judy ran down the street to get their neighbor, who happened to be a police officer. Betty grabbed the phone and called for help, but it was already too late. Peter was rushed to the hospital, yet the gunshot had done its damage. He died soon after, bleeding out from the wound. Imagine that for a moment. 1 minute you're in bed after a long night, your family safe at home. The next, the person you love most is lying in front of you, shot in cold blood, and you have no idea why. At first glance, this looked like a case of bad luck, a random act of violence, maybe even a botched robbery. But detectives would quickly realize there was nothing random about that gunshot on Halloween night. Someone had come to that house with a purpose. Someone had planned it. And the question was, who and why? Chapter 4. The Investigation and Dead Ends. When police arrived at the Fabiano home, the scene was quiet but tense. Peter was already gone, and Betty was in shock, unable to offer much more than fragmented words through tears. Detectives walked to the front porch, looked inside, and immediately felt the weight of frustration. Something about it didn't add up. There were no signs of forced entry, no ransacked rooms, no valuables missing. This didn't look like a robbery gone wrong. And when they searched the entryway and surrounding area, they noticed something else: no shell casing. Whoever pulled the trigger hadn't just fired and fled. They had come prepared. That kind of detail suggested planning, but planning by who? When investigators began asking Betty questions, she could hardly think straight. She had just lost her husband, and now she was being asked to piece together the impossible. Who would want Peter dead? Did he have enemies, business rivals, any disputes? She shook her head. Peter was, by all accounts, a man who worked hard, loved his family, and poured his time into the beauty shops he and Betty ran together. He wasn't flashy, and he didn't get into trouble. Detectives widened their scope, interviewing friends, relatives, employees, and neighbors. Again and again, the same description came up. Peter was friendly, honest, and likable. No one could think of a single person who would want to harm him, and that in itself felt suspicious. People don't usually get murdered for no reason. Days passed. The press started to pick up the story, framing it as a bizarre Halloween tragedy. A man shot dead at his front door, the killer possibly in costume vanishing into the night. It captured the public's imagination, but for detectives, the lack of leads was suffocating. Still, they kept circling back to Betty. Not because they suspected her, but because she was closest to Peter, and maybe, just maybe, she could think of something they had missed. At first, she insisted there was no one, but grief has a way of clearing fog over time, and eventually, a name surfaced. She told police about a woman named Joan. Joan Rabel. At first, it didn't seem like much, just a friend of the family, someone on the periphery. But it was the first real thread detectives had, and in a case like this, even the smallest thread can unravel the whole story. Chapter 5. The Locker, the Gun, and the Breakthrough. Weeks passed, and the case seemed to be going nowhere. Detectives had spoken to everyone they could think of, and nothing pointed in a clear direction. The name Joan Rabel lingered, but without evidence, she was just another face in the crowd. And then out of nowhere, the investigation took a strange turn. A month after Peter's death, the Los Angeles Police Department received a phone call. The voice on the other end wanted to remain anonymous. No name, no details, just a cryptic message. They told the police to check a locker, one of those rental lockers in a downtown department store. According to the caller, whatever was inside was connected to the Fabiano murder. At this point, detectives didn't have the luxury of ignoring leads, no matter how strange they sounded. So they tracked down the locker, got access, and when they opened it, what they found stunned them. Inside was a gun. Not just any gun, the very gun that had fired the bullet that killed Peter Fabiano. It was the first real piece of solid evidence in the entire case. No more speculation, no more circling the same empty interviews. This was tangible. This was traceable, and the locker itself was rented under a name, Goldine Pizer. Now police had to ask the obvious question. Who was Goldine on paper? She didn't make sense as a suspect. She wasn't connected to Peter, to Betty, or to their beauty salons. She was a secretary, divorced, living a quiet life in Los Angeles. She wasn't wealthy, she wasn't powerful, and she wasn't someone who stood out in any way. But she was the one renting the locker, and that gun tied her directly to the murder. So detectives brought her in, and almost immediately, things started to unravel. Because Goldine didn't deny anything. She didn't ask for a lawyer, she didn't stall. She didn't try to talk her way out of it. Within minutes of being questioned, she admitted to pulling the trigger. But the story she told next would turn the investigation upside down. Goldine wasn't acting alone. According to her, she had been persuaded, some might say, manipulated into carrying out the murder. And at the center of it all was the same woman Betty had named earlier, Joan Rabel. Chapter 6. The Confession and the Plot. When police first sat down with Goldine Pizer, they expected a long, drawn-out interrogation, maybe hours of pushing and prying before she slipped up. But that's not what happened. Goldine cracked almost immediately. She sighed, leaned back, and told them flat out, "Yes, I did it. I shot Peter Fabiano." She even said it was a relief to finally say the words out loud. But the real shock came when she explained why. Goldine told detectives she hadn't acted on her own. The entire plan from the very beginning had come from her friend, Joan Rabel, the same Joan whose name Betty had quietly mentioned weeks earlier. According to Goldine, Joan had spent months convincing her that Peter was a terrible man. She painted him as cruel, abusive toward Betty and her children, even corrupt, suggesting he was dealing drugs out of his home. Goldine had never met Peter herself, but she trusted Joan. And over time, she began to hate a man she didn't even know, a man she had only heard about through someone else's twisted version of the truth. The plan wasn't thrown together in a rush. Goldine said she and Joan talked about it for 3 months. 3 months of building up this story, feeding the anger and convincing Goldine that killing Peter was the only way to save Betty. On October 21st, just days before Halloween, Goldine bought a gun in Pasadena. She told the shop owner it was for home protection, but in reality, Joan paid for it. Joan also supplied the bullets. From the very start, Joan was making sure the paper trail pointed away from herself and straight at Goldine. And then came Halloween night. Goldine described how she and Joan dressed up in blue jeans, jackets, hats, and eye masks, disguises that could pass for cheap costumes. They slipped the gun into a paper bag like it was just part of the trick-or-treat routine. Around 9 p.m., they parked down the street from the Fabiano house and waited. They watched as the lights inside flicked off. That was their signal. Together, they walked up to the house. Goldine rang the doorbell once, then again. Peter answered. He had the candy bowl in hand, probably expecting a late-night trick-or-treater. He looked at the figures on his porch and said, "Isn't it a little late for this?" That's when Goldine pulled the trigger. The gun fired from inside the paper bag, striking Peter in the chest. He fell instantly. Goldine said she and Joan ran back to the car, hearts pounding, adrenaline rushing. They drove straight to a friend's house to return the car they had borrowed, burning their clothes along the way to destroy the evidence. And then in the final moments of their escape, Joan turned to Goldine and said coldly, "Forget you ever knew me." That sentence haunted Goldine. She realized in that instant that she had been nothing more than a pawn. She had killed a man for someone who never truly cared about her, someone who used her love and loyalty as tools. And that betrayal, that cold dismissal was what finally broke her. It was why she confessed so quickly, why she gave Joan's name without hesitation. Because she understood that she had been played, and she was left with nothing but guilt blood on her hands and a ruined life. Chapter 7. Joan's Obsession and the Real Motive. To really understand why Peter Fabiano ended up dead on his own doorstep, we need to look at Joan Rebel and the strange, complicated bond she had with Betty. Joan wasn't just a casual friend. She was a freelance photographer, someone who drifted into Peter and Betty's lives through the beauty salon. At first, it was innocent enough. She worked there, helped with photography, and quickly became close to both Peter and Betty. But over time, her attachment shifted. It wasn't Peter she wanted to be around. It was Betty. By the mid-1950s, Peter and Betty's marriage had started to crack. Arguments piled up, and eventually Betty moved out, taking her children with her. And where did she go? Straight into Joan's home. Now in the 1950s, two women living together was enough to raise eyebrows, and the newspapers of the time would only call their relationship abnormal. No one wanted to use the word lesbian in print, but the truth is, Joan was in love with Betty. Whether Betty felt the same way is harder to say. Maybe she did, maybe she didn't, but for Joan, Betty was everything. When Betty later reconciled with Peter, she agreed to one of his conditions: she had to cut ties with Joan completely. For Betty, it was a decision to salvage her marriage. For Joan, it was a betrayal. Overnight, she lost the woman she adored, the life she thought she was building. And in her mind, there was only one thing standing in the way: Peter. That's when obsession took root. Joan couldn't let go. She fixated on the idea that if Peter were gone, Betty would come back to her. She fed herself this narrative-twisting reality to justify what she was about to do. But Joan didn't act alone. She turned to Goldine Pizer, a woman who had admired her for years, someone lonely and eager for affection. Joan knew exactly how to play on that vulnerability. She filled Goldine's head with stories of Peter's supposed cruelty, convincing her that this wasn't just about love. It was about saving Betty from a dangerous man. Think about that for a second. Goldine had never even met Peter. Yet she hated him enough to buy a gun, wear a disguise, and pull the trigger. That's the power Joan had over her. It wasn't logic. It was manipulation, obsession, and a kind of control that only comes when one person completely surrenders to another. At the heart of it, Peter's murder wasn't about money. It wasn't about robbery or revenge in the usual sense. It was about love turned toxic, about one woman's refusal to accept rejection, and her willingness to eliminate the man who stood in her way. And when the truth started to surface in court, the picture that emerged was both tragic and disturbing. Because what happened on Halloween night wasn't just a murder, it was the result of a dangerous fantasy that blurred love, obsession, and desperation until someone finally pulled the trigger. Chapter 8. The Trial and the Verdict. Once police had both Goldine and Joan in custody, the courtroom drama began. The press swarmed in, calling it the trick-or-treat murder. A headline that captured the strangeness of the crime and the timing of it all. Halloween, a knock at the door, a costume disguise. It was chilling and unforgettable. Goldine didn't fight the accusations. She admitted from the start that she was the one who pulled the trigger. Her defense hinged on her mental state. She pleaded insanity, telling psychiatrists that she had been easily influenced, impressionable, and manipulated by Joan. In her mind, she wasn't a killer by choice. She was a pawn used and discarded by someone she loved. Joan, on the other hand, refused to say much of anything. She pled not guilty, offering no real explanation, no emotion, no acknowledgement of her role in the plot. It was as if she believed silence could shield her, that she could disappear into the background of her own crime. The courtroom weighed the evidence. The gun was in Goldine's name. She had pulled the trigger. But the months of planning, the lies about Peter, the motivation, all of that came from Joan. The jury couldn't ignore it. Both women were deeply entangled in the murder. In the end, prosecutors reduced the charges from first-degree murder to second-degree murder as part of a plea deal. And both Joan Rabel and Goldine Pizer were sentenced to 5 years to life in prison. 5 years to life. Think about that. Peter was gone forever, murdered in cold blood on his own doorstep, and the women responsible could technically walk free after only a few years behind bars. Even at the time, people criticized the sentence as too lenient a reflection of how differently women were sometimes treated in the courtroom compared to men. For the families left behind, no sentence could bring Peter back. Betty had lost her husband, Judy had lost a father figure, and the entire community was left to wonder how such an ordinary night had turned into something so horrific. But while the trial answered some questions, others still lingered. What exactly was Betty's role in all of this? Did she know more than she ever admitted? Was she truly just an innocent bystander, or did she play a silent part in pushing the story forward? Those questions never found answers. What was clear, though, was that the courtroom was not the final chapter. Both women would eventually walk free, and the story of what happened to them afterward is just as fascinating as the crime itself. Chapter 9. Life After Prison. When the trial ended and the headlines faded, the story of Joan and Goldine didn't just disappear. Both women had been sentenced to 5 years to life, but the reality is neither of them spent the rest of their days behind bars. Goldine Pizer was eventually released. She stayed in Los Angeles, living quietly far away from the glare of the press. In the 1970s, she even became active in community organizations, serving as an officer in a professional women's club. Imagine that, going from convicted murderer to respected member of a civic group. She lived a long life, passing away in 1998 at the age of 83. She never gave an interview, never wrote a book, never publicly explained her side again. It's as if she decided the only way to survive was to bury the past and live as if it never happened. Joan Rabel, though, is a different story. After her release, she practically vanished. Records of her life after prison are scarce, almost non-existent. Some say she might have changed her name, trying to erase herself from history. Others believe she simply kept a low profile, never speaking about the case again. For a woman who had orchestrated such a shocking crime, her silence afterward feels deliberate, almost chilling. It's like she slipped into the shadows and never came back. And then there was Betty. She remained in Los Angeles, raising her children, running the beauty salons, and moving forward with her life. She lived to be 81, passing away in 1999. To the outside world, she was simply a widow who had endured tragedy. But the question that lingers, one that people still whisper about, is whether she knew more than she let on. Did she ever reconcile her feelings for Joan? Did she suspect what was coming that Halloween night? Or was she, like Peter, completely blindsided by the violence that entered her home? These are the pieces of the story that history doesn't answer. The official record closes with 2 women walking free after a murder and a widow living out the rest of her life in quiet dignity. But beneath that surface lies a web of obsession, betrayal, and unanswered questions, and sometimes those unanswered questions are what haunt us the most. Chapter 10. Final Reflections. Looking back on the murder of Peter Fabiano. I can't help but feel like this case says as much about human obsession as it does about crime itself. On paper, it was simple: a man shot on Halloween night, his killer in costume, the motive buried in a toxic love triangle. But when you really pull it apart, it's about something deeper. What happens when desire turns into fixation, when love becomes possession, and when rejection sparks destruction? Joan couldn't accept that Betty had chosen Peter. To her, Peter wasn't just a husband. He was an obstacle, a problem to be solved, and Goldine. She was so desperate for affection, so eager to be seen, that she allowed herself to be used as a weapon. One woman's obsession and another woman's vulnerability came together, and Peter paid the price. But here's what unsettles me the most. The punishment never really matched the crime. Two women plotted a murder, carried it out in cold blood, and yet they walked out of prison free to live the rest of their lives. Peter never got that chance. Betty never got her husband back. Judy never got her father figure. It's hard not to wonder if justice was ever truly served. And then there's Betty herself. Was she just a grieving widow caught in a nightmare? Or was there more to the story? Did she really cut Joan out of her life, or did some hidden thread tie them together even after Peter's death? We'll never know because none of them spoke openly about it. Silence became the final layer of this case. What lingers is the image of that front door on Halloween night, the sound of the bell, the sigh of a tired man getting up from bed, and then the single shot that shattered everything. One moment of trust opening the door to what he thought were trick-or-treaters was enough to end a life and unravel an entire family. For me, this story is a reminder that the darkest dangers don't always come from strangers in the shadows. Sometimes they come from people already inside our lives, people who claim to love us. And sometimes the scariest mask is the one worn by someone we think we know. So as we close this case, I want to leave you with this thought: obsession dressed up as love is still obsession. And when someone tells you they'd do anything for you, it's worth asking what anything really means. And that brings us to the end of today's case. The murder of Peter Fabiano is one of those stories that stays with me not just because of the bizarre timing on Halloween night, but because of what it reveals about human nature. Love can be powerful, but when it slips into obsession, it can become destructive, even deadly. I can't help but wonder what Betty truly knew or how she really felt about Joan. Was she a victim of circumstance, or was there more to her silence we'll probably never know? What we do know is that Peter's life was stolen in a single moment, and the people responsible for it walked free far earlier than many think they deserved. Thank you so much for spending this time with me. If you found this story as unsettling and fascinating as I did, make sure to subscribe to True Crime Echoes so you don't miss the next case we explore together. Until then, take care of yourselves, be cautious about the people you trust, and remember, sometimes the scariest monsters don't wear masks at all.